G'day guys, Matt here from Not in the Manual. Tonight's video I want to make is going to be on range, LFP battery, degradation, charging habits. I just thought it's a bit of an update video to one that I made about 7 or 8 months ago when this car was 1 year old. And in that video I tried to just assess my battery health to the best of my knowledge at the time. Through a lot of comments and things in that video, I have learned, it prompted me to research that a bit more. So I've learned a fair bit more about the batteries. This is where the comments are great because it can start other conversations. It shows me other people's viewpoints, and it allows you guys to ask me questions about things that it doesn't bother me at all how simple the question is. So some of those questions were on charging habits and what effect different charging habits have on this battery. So I've got a lot more experience since then with the car. Yeah, we can look at where my degradation is at this point in time, and I'll give you my opinion on degradation, how I calculate that, or one of the ways that I calculate that, and yeah, we'll just have a bit of a general chat. But first up, we're going to focus on range, because I do get a lot of questions about range with the car, and this will be applicable whether you have an LFP battery or not. So what we're going to do is just have a look at the different ways that you can see what range you have left on your battery, and I'll just explain to you which ones are useful, which ones are not so useful, and why. We're having a look here at the main screen of the car, and you might notice at the top here next to the battery symbol, it's saying that I've got 407 kilometers of range. So I don't normally have that showing. I normally just have it at 100%, because this range is not based on your driving style. It's based on a background range calculation of the car, which is based off an EPA consumption figure for this car. So 407, I think that's based off roughly, I think it's 132 watt hours per kilometre, which was the published EPA rating, or the WLTP rating for this car. It's around that figure, and I don't really pay much attention to that, because your driving style has so much of an effect over the range that you will get. This figure is really unrealistic. If every drive you did was exactly the same consumption, that figure would be great, but this can say that I've got 100 kilometers worth of range left in the battery, and my consumption figure can be 150 watt hours per kilometer on that particular drive, and it's not going to factor that in. So it will say you've got 100 kilometers left, and you don't. You've got much less than that. So, or on the other hand, it can say you've only got 20 kilometers left, and you could have 50 if you're getting a better consumption figure than that roughly 130 watt hours per kilometre. So I don't like that. I don't use that figure. It's not realistic anyway. Mine and everyone else's range consumption figures change so often, so on each drive. So really, I think turn that off, have a percentage displayed like you do on your phone, and for a dose of reality, a more realistic range display, you need to go into the Energy app and go to the Consumption tab. So in this Consumption tab, you have I have 421 kilometers of range projected. So that's much more than this range display was saying up here at 407. That's based on the last 50 kilometers that I've driven, which is basically to and from work, a round trip for me. I averaged 123 watt hours per kilometer, which is pretty good. So if I was just to keep doing that trip over and over and over again, I would have 421 kilometers of range before I hit 0%. And even that's really unrealistic for city driving as well, because I charge this car almost every day and just top it up to 100%. I don't do it every day. Sometimes I leave it a few days. You can see I've just charged to 100% for this video here at home, but normally I just charge probably 90% of the time. I'm charging at work off, used to be off a 10 amp power point, but we've now got a Tesla wall charger, and we're getting 11 kilowatts charging speed, which is pretty fast really for daily charging. So I don't need to charge every day. When it used to take a couple of hours to top up my commute driving, or any driving I did during the day for work, I just keep the car plugged in all the time. Now, having the wall connector there and getting 11 kilowatts of charging speed, I just plug it in every now and again and top it up to 100, no problem. And that is 100% solar for us, being powered by the solar panels, unless it's a super overcast rainy day. So probably, you know, somewhere between 80 and 90% of the energy for this car comes from solar, which is pretty good. And having an electric vehicle makes you think about where the electricity is coming from. So I'm pretty lucky to be able to do that at work. So that's really my charging habit there. So that allows me to sort of top that back up. So I've just topped it up here at home off the 10 amp, which gives me 2 kilowatt of charging speed, 240 volts, 10 amps. At 100%, you're going to see what your range is at 100% every time. But yeah, I've charged 100% here. Now, for the majority of people, you're going to be able to either charge at work or charge at home. You're only going to ever be topping up small amounts unless you live in an apartment where you don't have access to charging when you're at home and you don't have access to charging at work. You'll be totally reliant on the public charging network. So you won't be charging your car to 100% every day if you don't need to. And looking at this range is going to be a bit more applicable for you if you're running your car down close to, 10, 20%. This will become a useful tool for you. So my advice still stands. If you're in that position, use this consumption figure if you want a realistic figure of your range. So at 50 kilometers, this is really going to sort of smooth out a lot of the ups and downs of hills. And I prefer to use the last 50 kilometers. But if you want the car to be responding a bit faster to your driving style, then you can narrow down that window of consumption here, of the average consumption. So you can see for the last 10 kilometers, I was sort of climbing up hills to get up to at the elevation of where my house is. And so you can see a higher consumption figure there. Now, if I was to just drive at that consumption figure, that's going to be my range to 0%. The last 25 kilometers was a little bit more of a mix of things, but my climb up to work, the last 20 kilometers, is going from sea level up to my house, which is about 120, 130 meters above sea level. So there's a bit of climbing there and a bit of stop-start, a lot of traffic lights. So it's not very efficient, my journey home. But my journey to work is very efficient because most of that is downhill. This is giving me one way, but the 50 kilometers is giving me my round trip to work, which is a bit more realistic consumption figure. So you can see there, but that last 20 kilometers, 10 kilometers. So if you hit some bad weather on a long trip, you can just put it on for the last 10 kilometers and that will respond a bit more instantaneously. Not instant, but it's going to give you a bit more of a realistic figure as to where your consumption is at that time. And then you can think, well, you can watch that range change as that weather hits you, whether it's windy weather, rainy weather, snowy weather, or whatever. You can watch your projected range change there as your average consumption changes for the last 10. Now, if you want to see a bit more of an instant range prediction, this is going to update every, almost instantaneously as you're driving along. So if you want to just basically have a look at what effect your, say, climate has, you can turn your climate down or change your climate and watch an instantaneous result for that. That's if you're, looking down to that level of efficiency. Or you could drop your speed by 10 kilometers an hour and watch where the projected range goes there. You might want to change your speed and see what happens. So you might be thinking, can I make it to this particular point? Flick it to instant range, drop your speed by 10 kilometers an hour and have a look what effect that has. So that's every little tab here is useful. So I prefer to just leave that on average range, last 50 kilometers. Now, if you're on a trip navigating somewhere, then you can just go to the navigation screen here. And I've just navigated into the city. I'd only use 3% to get into the city. It's a bit of downhill from my place to get into the city. So there's not going to be a huge consumption, but you can see there I'll have 97% when I arrive at that destination. Now this figure here is based off the elevation changes. I think it's calculating wind, and it is going to change as you're driving. That figure will vary, and this is a reasonably accurate figure. I've tested this out a few times going to destinations, and it's actually reasonably accurate. So this is the calculation that Tesla have updated over the years, and this is a good one to use as well. But my opinion is this energy app projected range is going to be much more accurate than any other method. So I'd definitely be using that when looking at range. So that's my feeling on range. And that sums up my 18 months experience of driving this car and what I've found. And knowing how these figures are calculated in the background really helps you understand that. So what I'm going to do next is we're going to have a look at degradation. We're going to look at the range degradation I've had with this car from the beginning. We're going to look at the data logging website that I use called teslafi, and I've used that pretty much since I bought the car. So that's got a pretty good record of the range degradation on this car. So we can have a look at that and look at some trends there. And then we're going to look at ScanMyTesla and look at the kilowatt hour capacity of the car and have a look at looking at degradation that way. And it really does sort of line up with the kilometers, because it's a consistent range calculation on here. It's using the remaining kilowatt hour capacity of the battery against that set consumption figure and calculating that range. So we're going to be looking at that from a different angle, looking at the kilowatt hour capacity of the battery. So yeah, let's get into that. All right guys, so what we're going to do here is just have a quick look at a battery degradation report that I get from teslafi. Now, I've had a teslafi account since pretty close to when I bought the car. So I've got my car's whole lifetime of data in this battery report. So we'll take a look at that, and then we'll compare that to what we can see in ScanMyTesla for my battery stats right now. And I'll tell you the pros and the cons to these figures, and just give you an idea of where the degradation's at in my car at the moment. Since last year, I've found out a bit more information. I've been in touch with, well, actually the other day I saw a tweet that Tom Ludicrous Feed made, and I commented on that tweet. He tweeted about his degradation, and I just gave a little bit of advice there, and it made me question while I was writing that tweet back to Tom. It just made me question my theory a little bit, and I thought, look, I'm going to go back and check with the developer at ScanMyTesla, Amund, and see what he thinks of my theory about the figures that I'm using, and just get his take on it. After chatting with him, I've just learnt that I probably was on the right track a little bit. It's just that some of these figures aren't exactly accurate, so I'm going to discuss that as well. So if we have a look, I'm doing a screen grab on my laptop screen here now. So if we have a look now at the battery degradation report, you can see here at the top, battery degradation report. This is in teslafi. So if I hadn't told you before, teslafi is a web-based bit of software that you give access to grab data from your car. So what this battery degradation report is, the figures of range calculation. So you know that guessometer range calculation we spoke about earlier. It's what it is when my car is fully charged to 100%. And it logs that figure all the time. And because this is the LFP, my battery is charged to 100% regularly. So this report is quite useful. But what this degradation report does, it actually overlays all the software update points with the car. Now, the theory that I had looking at this was that the capacity of the battery is altered by Tesla, or possibly they're altering the way that the the available battery capacity is calculated, and that gets changed during updates. And if you look here on this report, you can see that often after an update, there's a couple of examples here. It's not every update. You can see here that it runs along flat there for a while, and then all of a sudden I get an update here and it drops down. It doesn't line up perfectly with some of them, but it was just a theory I had. I noticed a trend here, and you can see here that it goes along okay for a while, then it drops again after these updates. It just seems like too much of a coincidence to me, but it could just be how Tesla are changing the background calculation as to how it changes the available capacity in the battery when it's fully charged. I can also see from this battery degradation report, you can see that initially my battery, the capacity dropped a lot. So it was coming down around here, you know, within that first 6 months, it sort of settled down. And from this point onwards here, which you can see was, you know, around the beginning of 2022. So just over 6, 7, 8 months, it really started to settle down. And I think really this point here, where you can see it cruises along and my range didn't really change too much. And even over that time, you look at that trend line now, whoops, mine's the blue one. You look at that trend line now and it's not as steep a drop-off curve as there was here when I first got the car. And so that, I think, is the battery sort of settling in. It's this settling in phase that the batteries do. So once they see, you know, a couple of months of charge cycles, everything is sort of settling down and it's like the battery sort of bedding in. And this is what I've read, you know, look, this isn't something I've done experiments on. So I'm just reading information I've found during my research. I think this graph really reflects that as well. So I think that's quite good. But, you know, the developer from ScanMyTesla he didn't see the same thing I was seeing, that the range was dropping after updates. But look, make a call for yourself. I think there's a little bit of a trend there, not with every update, but you can see it's a definite drop off with some of the updates there. And I think the LFP battery was pretty new back at this stage for Tesla. And I think, you know, back in June 2021, and this car was built in May of 2021 in the factory in Shanghai. You know, I think there was still a lot of software changes being made in those early days. So I think some of that probably does, it's too much of a coincidence, but I think this graph is actually pretty good. Even though it's using that range that I don't think is super accurate, I think it's accurate for things like this because that range is based on the available capacity in the battery at 100% state of charge. So if we look down here further on that report, you can see here that based on the range I had originally when I got the car to where my low range is now, we're looking at around 4% range loss. And that's, you know, on a battery, you know, that initial figure when the battery was first installed in the car. So now we know that that's sort of a bit of an artificial figure, and then the battery goes through this settling stage, and then you get your consistent battery capacity that you're going to have. So I think, you know, from around this point, so from, where are we looking at here? You know, around the middle of 2022, so when it was about a year old, you can start, or even before then really. So back here, probably in, you know, around a few months into 2022, it did start settling down. The degradation sort of dropped off, or that range degradation dropped off and started to settle along. And if you look from that point there, instead we're going from something like 414 kilometers down to, you know, 407. So I've really only lost 7 kilometers off the range figure. So you can see how this is such a grey area looking at degradation. So if we move over now to ScanMyTesla, I'll overlay that on the video here now. So we can look there. Oh, this is the usual screen I have. I have ScanMyTesla running every time I drive the car. So you can see there, I like watching where the battery temperature is, where the rear stator temperature is, you know, the max regen power available. So yeah, you can sort of see a lot of figures here. And when I stand my foot on the, well, I'm actually plugged in, so I can't actually bring the drivetrain online to look at some other figures. But where we want to look at is the battery tab. So if we go to the battery tab here, we're getting a couple of the figures I want to look at. And I need to get into it because I don't want this to go on for too long. Now the figures that I want to look at here are full pack when new, we can see 55.1, and then nominal full pack. So this isn't, we're not talking about buffers or anything like that. This is the full capacity available from the battery, you know, right down to when the car would cut out. So full pack when new, so when this battery was installed, there was a 55.1 kilowatt hour capacity figure put on there. So when new. Now, that figure, we're not sure where that figure came from. That figure is just floating around the CAN bus and someone's been able to interpret that. There could be another figure floating around, but it just hasn't been interpreted yet from the CAN bus. So ScanMyTesla rely on a community of guys that do CAN bus dumps and try and interpret the CAN bus signal going around. Tesla don't publish a CAN bus cross-reference to say this particular signal in the CAN bus is this. So a lot of people have put in a lot of hard work to give you what is available here in ScanMyTesla. And I've done CAN bus dumps and tried to interpret data and things before. I'm not that great at it, but it's not easy. It can be pretty complicated. So in interpreting those signals. So what we can do here is look at full pack when new and compare that to nominal full pack. So my car is charged to 100% at the moment, and the nominal full pack is 51.9 as opposed to 55.1 when it was new. Now I did some videos back then and I've got some screenshots, and it was 55.1 when I first got the car. And then that dropped off dramatically in that first 6 months, and it has sort of settled down and it's not dropping at as much of a rate as you could see in that battery degradation report. But looking at that 55.1, we know that, you know, that is not the figure after the battery has settled. So I think it's probably more than likely 52.5 kilowatt hours from what I can find on the internet, which means if we look at the 51.9 as opposed to 52.5, I've got almost no degradation whatsoever if you look at it from that point. If we look at it from 55.1 down to 51.9, then, you know, I've got around the 5% mark in degradation. And that does seem like a fair bit of degradation for an LFP after this time. But really, I'm not seeing a problem with my battery. The state of health is actually still quite good. I'm not seeing any huge cell imbalances there. I'm not seeing a huge voltage drop under acceleration. And I'm quite happy with it, but you know, that figure is still coming down. Now the usable remaining figure, that's what I have going down to 0%. So that's what I've got 49.8 kilowatt hours available, and then I'm down to 0. So that's what I've got available from 100% down to 0%. So look, my take on this, I'm still pretty happy with where it's at the moment, especially now learning that that full pack when new figure probably isn't a very accurate figure, and my real sort of rated capacity of the battery is probably a little bit less than that. And all I could find was this 52.5 kilowatt hour figure. I found that in a couple of sites giving specs for this car, but Tesla don't actually publish that themselves. Not anywhere I could find anyway. Now, that's my take on the degradation of my car and where it's at the moment. So I think that's still pretty acceptable. I think to lose, you know, from 424 kilometers when I first bought the car down to 407 on a figure that really isn't realistic, I'm not that concerned by that at all, because, you know, I can achieve a pretty good figure if I just change my driving style. And if I want to have a bit of fun and push the car a bit, well, I know I'm not going to get that many kilometers. So it's really going to come down to the individual person and how they drive, you know, like I spoke about range earlier in the video. So yeah, I'm pretty happy with the state of health of my battery, and that's another question I get asked. I'm going to move on now and just talk about charging habits. So the LFP battery charged to 100% isn't as stressed as other nickel cobalt chemistries. So we're looking at 3.5 volts per cell when it's fully charged. Now there is a little bit of headroom there even for an LFP battery. So LFP batteries tend to top out at about 3.6 volts per cell. So I've actually got a little bit of reserve capacity there at the top end of the battery as well. And there's a tiny little buffer there. That's just my opinion. Looking at how, the behavior of LFP batteries. So I think there is a little bit there as well. The battery isn't that stressed. So when you compare it to the voltage of a fully charged nickel cobalt battery, they're about 4 volts per cell. So you're looking at a lot more stress in that battery, a higher voltage. The battery's under a bit more stress and strain, and it's not good for the nickel cobalt chemistry to be up at that 100% mark. So the LFP is quite happy. So an LFP charge to 100% is like charging a nickel cobalt battery to maybe 80%. And so it's no problem. If you want to charge your LFP battery to 100% every day, go for it. I don't think that's going to be an issue for you, and it's actually what Tesla recommend. So they wouldn't recommend you do something that is going to harm the battery, that they're possibly going to have to replace at their expense. So I think take Tesla's advice, charge it to 100% whenever you can. And to be honest, if you can't charge to 100% every day, that's fine as well. If you live in an apartment and you're relying on public infrastructure to charge your car, you can't charge at work, it just may not be practical for you to keep the car charged to 100% every day. But as long as you're giving it a top up to 100% once or twice a week, and you reset that battery management, you calibrate that 100% mark again, that's going to be good enough for your battery health. So some of these things, some of these charging habits with LFP revolve around the accuracy of the state of charge. So by charging the LFP battery to 100%, you're resetting the battery management system's start point for the battery capacity. So it knows at 100% it has a certain amount of capacity, and then it's measuring out the energy on the amps that the battery gives out. It then knows, it looks at that, say the amps over time, and then works out how much power has come out of the battery. So it is using the column counting technique, which is what that is called, to determine the battery's state of charge, and it compares that against the voltage per cell of the battery. Now the LFP can't rely on the voltage alone, because there isn't much of a range of voltage between fully charged to fully discharged. And I've been through this in my previous videos as well. So it does need to monitor the energy discharge from the battery as well as the voltage, and use a combination of both to give you an accurate state of charge. Now, I've had some people comment about a thing called the memory effect with LFP batteries. So I thought I might just explain the basics of that, because you may have someone mention that to you. And what that is, there were some studies done on LFP battery chemistry that looked for a memory effect. And what that means, if I just charge my LFP battery to 70%, 75% or whatever, if you're charging it just to the same point every time and you don't give it a full charge to 100%, it starts to develop a little voltage hump at that state of charge, that particular point. So you come along, 3.4, 3.4, 3.4, it might then jump up to 3.45. And that's enough at that point to have a little bit of a voltage spike or a hump in the voltage curve to throw out your state of charge. So that will be like an artificial sort of degradation, where you will lose, the state of charge won't be that accurate. But it looks like from the research I could do into that if you charge to 100% and cycle it a few times after that, you can actually smooth that back out again and get rid of that little memory effect that happens. Now, someone else may have a better explanation of that, but that's all I could find on it. So there was some research done in Japan on this originally, and then there were a few papers written after that I've read that seemed to be, they looked at the paper written in Japan and they were able to replicate this memory effect in their own studies. But it does appear that, it's something it's not going to cause you long-term battery issues. If you charge to 100% for a few cycles there, you can actually correct that again anyway. So that's, I hadn't heard of that before, so that's something I've learned since I did my last video. and I thought it'd be nice to mention that here tonight. So yeah, my advice is charge your LFP to 100% whenever you can, no problem. You're not really going to hurt the battery. You're not going to cause any extra degradation. Still, the worst thing you can do if the LFP battery is supercharged all the time, regularly. That is going to probably damage your battery more than anything else you can do. And of course, over discharging it down below 0%, you're going to damage the battery doing that as well. So the rest of the time, let the battery management system look after your battery for you, and just try not to put too much thought in it. That's one of the benefits of LFP. Plug it in whenever you want, don't give it any thought, let it charge to 100%, and it's designed to make things a bit easier. So guys, that's all I wanted to explain tonight. So hopefully you've learned something there. I've definitely learned something a few things since I last did this video, and hopefully you've enjoyed this update. And yeah, I'm still super happy with the car, super happy with the LFP battery. Thanks for watching this video, and I'll catch you next time.